I want to take you back to Dry Drayton some 430 years ago, to the end of the 16th century. I will try to paint a picture of the village as it was, what life was like then, and what was happening in the world beyond. The most significant building was the manor house in the park, known then as Drayton Park. The rectory originally stood in the northwest of the manor house, in what was known as Parson's Grove. There were many closes, or small holdings, which lay around a network of lanes. There were, of course, ways out of the village, and it is likely that a way across pastures towards Madingley had been established by this time. The church would have been much smaller than today, but nevertheless an important building. There would have been a mix of arable and livestock farming, with perhaps hundreds of sheep in Dry Drayton. There was concern in the country about the poor. Church wardens were assisted by village overseers in distributing the poor rate. Children over the age of 7 were deemed able to work and were apprenticed to tradesmen. Magistrates were given draconian powers to order men between the ages of 12 and 60 to work, and to restrict movement if a worker wanted to leave his current employment. There is one heart-warming story between the lines of James Granger's will in 1617 concerning James the little boy I do keep, evidently a foundling, since he was given the name of Drayton, to whom his foster father left a cow at Over to breed and stock withal. Let us hope he made a success of it.
What do we find going on in the world outside Dry Drayton? Well, in 1592, Elizabeth I was queen, and in London, which was then a city of 200,000, there were 10,000 deaths from the plague. In 1597, William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was published, and in 1605 there was the Gunpowder Plot. The population of Britain was about 4 million, and of the world about 500 million. Due to high infant mortality, life expectancy was just 33 to 40 years of age.
So this is the setting in which our story begins. There is an official record in the Archbishop of Canterbury's register confirming the appointment in Dry Drayton on the 22nd of June 1592 of Richard Warfield to the rectory. Richard Warfield followed the Puritan tradition and seems to have been a man of gentle piety. Richard was just 34 years old when appointed to Dry Drayton, and he and his wife Elizabeth had several children, at least 7 of whom were born in the village. But sadly, Elizabeth and 6 of the children died before Richard. In his will, he asked to be buried as near as may be to my dearest wife in the chancel of Dry Drayton Church. He died in the village in March 1619 at the age of 61.
Richard and Elizabeth's youngest son, John, had been christened in the village in 1613, and after his father's death, the young child moved, we believe, to family in London. John became a watchmaker, married, and had a family. This was the era when many ships, including the Mayflower, sailed with pilgrims to the New World. John Warfield's eldest son, Richard, traveled to the New World not as a pilgrim, but was brought to Maryland in about 1659 at the age of 13 as an indentured servant. However, on a return visit to London 30 years after he had been brought to America as a servant, Richard was a leading citizen of the province of Maryland, an officer, a captain of the militia, and a wealthy planter. His land holdings at that time were said to exceed the acreage of the city of London. If we now jump about 170 years to 1861, we find that the Warfields had become regarded as ancestral founders of the state of Maryland. We also find Captain Richard Warfield's great-great-great-great great-grandson Henry McTeer Warfield with a wife, Anna, and 3 sons. However, the now independent United States of America is at the outbreak of civil war. America remained at war with itself for 4 years, but shortly after, things looked up with the purchase of Alaska from Russia. This era also saw Lewis Carroll publish Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the invention of the modern safety bicycle. The population of Britain had grown to about 18 million, and of the world to about 1.5 billion. Life expectancy had risen to about 43 years of age.
In 1861, Dry Drayton had changed considerably. Over the centuries, the manor house in Drayton Park was rebuilt and enlarged. The rectory too had been rebuilt, but it was demolished just a few years later to improve the view from the manor house. Eventually, a new substantial red brick rectory was built on the hill overlooking the village in 1729, and 100 years later the Reverend Samuel Smith was to build a newer rectory on this site, the rather gaunt building that stands neglected today. The manor house itself was pulled down in 1817, since when there have been no buildings in the park. In 1861, Samuel Smith's younger brother William was rector of Dry Drayton. The church was now larger and had splendid pews and an elaborate pulpit. The population of the village was about 475, and William Smith claimed an average attendance at morning services of 70 to 100 and up to 190 in the afternoons.
Queen Victoria was on the throne, and elsewhere in the world, we note that in this era, Dmitri Mendeleev created the periodic table. Stanley met Dr. Livingstone near Lake Tanganyika in East Africa. The first recognized international football match between England and Scotland was played in 1872, and blue jeans and barbed wire were invented.
Most significantly for our story is that in 1861 there were occasional visits to Dry Drayton by a future King of England. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Queen Victoria, had become the first member of the royal family to visit the USA, and in 1861 he was resident at Madingley Hall for a time while studying at Trinity College, Cambridge. He paid occasional visits to the rectory and the church in Dry Drayton, and would have travelled along what is now the modern Madingley Road. During this time he was persuaded to donate £20 for the repair of the Dry Drayton Church Tower and for the enlargement of the village school. His presence at church services must have been a matter of some excitement, and correspondence between the outgoing and incoming ministers reveals that the future king sat on the pew to the left of the door, where he was no doubt the object of much respectful curiosity. A later rector, Francis Walker, even offered to pay for a plaque to commemorate the royal visits, but no trace of one has been found. This prince, who frequented our village, later became King Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions and Emperor of India. Upon his death in 1910, he was followed as king by his son, George V.
Meanwhile, back in Maryland, in the USA, Henry Warfield's children had grown up, and his middle son, Teakle Wallace Warfield, had married Alice Montague in 1895. They had a daughter born the next year and named her Bessie Wallace Warfield. Sadly, Teakle died of TB shortly afterwards at the age of 27. In the brief time Teakle and Alice had together, the world saw the first gramophone record and the discovery of X-rays and of radioactivity.
We now move forward to England in 1936. George V died, and his eldest son Edward, that is the grandson of our Dry Drayton visiting prince, was automatically declared King Edward VIII.
However, he was not crowned. Following a great scandal, he had to abdicate the throne as he had met and wished to marry Teakle Warfield's daughter, the double divorcee Wallis Simpson. She had dropped the name Bessie and was now known as just Wallis, but nevertheless was the very person whose 9-time great-grandfather had been rector in Dry Drayton. Yes, 10 generations and over 300 years later, Wallis Warfield Simpson, born in the United States and the direct descendant of Richard Warfield, appointed rector in Dry Drayton in 1592, made world news with her association with the new king. The views of society at that time, and more importantly of the Church of England, of which Edward was nominally the supreme governor, led to Edward having to abdicate in order to marry the woman he loved.
In 1936, Dry Drayton was a quiet village of less than 400 souls, tended by the recently appointed rector, the Reverend Alan Armstrong. He would have been preaching in the very same church as Richard Warfield, 25 incumbents before, and in which 75 years before, a future king had prayed.
We can speculate, but it is unlikely that the Reverend Armstrong or any of his parishioners were aware of the very tenuous connection of the village with the royal scandal which was unfolding in the world outside Dry Drayton.
After Edward's abdication, his brother replaced him as King George VI. Edward and Wallis married in 1937, and they had 35 years together. Edward died in 1972, and Wallis in 1986.
And so ends our story.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor, that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. And I lay down my burden. God bless you all. God save the King.